The date was late September 1944, and in the rain-lashed peaks of the Apennine Mountains, a battle-hardened officer of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division crouched behind a shattered stone wall, watching something that defied everything the German military had taught him about the American soldier. Men who had just watched half their platoon cut down by machine gun fire were not retreating. They were climbing higher, closer, faster, screaming through the smoke with bayonets fixed. And in that moment, he understood a truth that would haunt Waffen-SS veterans for the rest of their lives. The American infantryman in Italy was not the soft, machine-dependent fighter German propaganda had promised. He was something far more dangerous, a man who absorbed catastrophic losses and kept coming anyway. And this is the story of how that realization reshaped German tactical thinking in the mountains of Italy, a campaign so brutal, so grinding, and so misunderstood that even today it remains overshadowed by Normandy and the Eastern Front, despite producing some of the most ferocious infantry combat of the entire Second World War. To understand why German officers, some of the most experienced killers in Hitler's arsenal, would later admit in post-war interviews and memoirs that American ground troops frightened them more than Allied air power, you have to first understand what the Wehrmacht and the SS expected when they faced the United States Army, because German military doctrine going back to the interwar years had built an entire worldview around American weakness. The assumption inherited from analyzing the U.S. Army's late and disorganized entry into the First World War, the belief that a nation of factory workers, farmers, and shopkeepers could never produce soldiers with the discipline and aggression of Prussian-trained infantry, and this assumption was reinforced early in the North African campaign, where inexperienced American units suffered humiliating defeats at places like the Kasserine Pass in February 1943, a battle German commanders studied closely and used to justify their contempt. But Kasserine was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of an extraordinarily fast and brutal education, because the United States Army that landed in Sicily in July 1943 and later at Salerno in September, and then began the agonizing climb up the Italian peninsula, was already a different force, hardened by North Africa, reorganized under new leadership, and increasingly stocked with young men who had trained for over a year, specifically for the kind of close-quarters mountain warfare Italy would demand. And it was in Italy, not France, not the Ardennes, that German infantry commanders first began to seriously reconsider what they thought they knew about American fighting spirit. The terrain itself became almost a third combatant in this war, because Italy's spine is the Apennine mountain range, a brutal, folding landscape of steep ridgelines, narrow valleys, vast rivers, and villages perched on outcroppings that seemed engineered by nature specifically to favor the defender. And the German army, retreating northward through 1943 and 1944, exploited this terrain with ruthless skill, constructing a series of fortified defensive belts that stretched across the peninsula, the most famous being the Gothic Line anchored around Monte Cassino, and later, further north, the Gothic Line, a nearly 200-mile fortified barrier stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, built with thousands of forced laborers who dug bunkers into solid rock, installed steel gun turrets salvaged from obsolete tanks, laid minefields in the tens of thousands, and positioned interlocking machine gun nests so that any approach up a slope could be raked from 2 or 3 directions simultaneously. And this was the landscape into which American infantry divisions, the 34th, the 36th, the 3rd, the 85th, the 88th, and later African American soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division, were ordered to advance, often on foot, often at night, often without the armor or artillery support that had made American operations elsewhere so devastatingly effective, because tanks simply could not climb many of these slopes. And close air support was frequently grounded by the fog and rain that blanketed the mountains for weeks at a time, which meant that in Italy, more than almost any other theater in the West, the war came down to the rifleman, the machine gunner, the mortar crew, and the raw willingness of ordinary men to keep moving forward into fire. It was in this environment, stripped of the technological advantages that German soldiers had come to associate with American warfare, that Waffen-SS units, including elements of the 16th SS Panzergrenadier Division Reichsfuhrer SS, which had been transferred to Italy in 1944 and later became infamous for brutal anti-partisan operations, including the massacre at Sant'Anna di Stazzema, found themselves in direct sustained contact with American infantry along the Gothic Line and in the Serchio Valley, and it was here that post-war accounts from German officers began to describe something that unsettled them deeply. Not the roar of Allied bombers, not the crash of naval gunfire, but the behavior of the American soldier once he was on the ground and taking casualties, because German tactical doctrine, refined over years of war, was built around the principle that a well-placed defensive position, properly sited with interlocking fields of fire, would break the will of any attacking force through sheer weight of casualties. This was the logic behind the entire Gustav and Gothic line system. Force the enemy to advance uphill into prepared kill zones, inflict catastrophic losses in the first assault waves, and watch the attack collapse as survivors either retreated or went aground, and this WWII workers brutally repeatedly against many Allied units throughout the war. But German officers in Italy began reporting in letters, in unit diaries, and later in post-war interviews conducted by historians that American infantry units did not always break the way the doctrine predicted, that platoons which had lost a third or even half their men in an initial assault would reorganize under fire, call in what artillery support they could get, and launch a second attack within hours, sometimes exploiting exactly the same ground that had just cost them so many casualties. And this pattern, repeated across multiple engagements from the Casino front through the Gothic Line battles of autumn 1944, became a source of genuine professional alarm among German commanders who prided themselves on understanding the psychology of combat. One of the most striking post-war observations to emerge from German veterans of the Italian campaign centered on the sheer physical endurance and stubbornness of the American rifle squad in mountain fighting, because contrary to the stereotype of an army that relied entirely on mechanization and firepower to substitute for infantry skill, the reality German defenders encountered in the high Apennines was a soldier who could and did fight for control of a single stone farmhouse or a single terraced hillside for days, using improvised tactics, flanking maneuvers through terrain German planners had assessed as impassable, and a willingness to close to grenade range and even hand-to-hand distance that ran completely counter to the propaganda image of the risk-averse American reliant on overwhelming material advantage. And German officers noted with a kind of grudging, almost bewildered respect that American units seemed to absorb the psychological shock of ambush and heavy casualties far better than doctrine suggested they should, reorganizing leadership on the spot when officers and sergeants were killed, with privates and corporals stepping into command roles and continuing the attack, a pattern of decentralized initiative that was, ironically, something German military culture itself claimed to prize through its own doctrine of Auftragstactik, or mission-type tactics, which made encountering it in an enemy army all the more disorienting because these officers had been trained to believe that only German soldiers possessed this kind of small unit initiative, and finding it in American farm boys and factory workers from Ohio and Texas and Brooklyn forced an uncomfortable reassessment of their own assumptions. The fighting around the Gothic Line in the autumn of 1944 produced some of the starkest examples of this dynamic as American units of the Fifth Army pushed into the mountains north of Florence in a campaign that has received far less popular attention than the more famous battles of Cassino or Anzio, but which in many ways represented an even purer test of infantry endurance, because by this stage of the war, German defenders had learned from earlier mistakes and constructed some of the most sophisticated field fortifications of the entire European theater. With bunkers cut into solid granite, pre-registered mortar, and artillery concentrations on every approach, and machine gun positions sited with mathematical precision to cover every possible line of advance, and yet American infantry, often reinforced by soldiers who had already survived Cassino, Anzio, and the brutal river crossings of the Rapido and Volturno, continued to grind forward, taking individual peaks and ridgelines through actions that rarely made headlines back home, but which German defenders remembered vividly decades later, describing assaults where American squads would take a position, be thrown off by a German counterattack, and then retake the same ground within hours, a cycle that repeated itself across ridge after ridge through October and November 1944 as the weather deteriorated and both sides fought increasingly through mud, fog, and freezing rain that made resupply and medical evacuation a nightmare for everyone involved. What made this resilience particularly unsettling to German officers, according to post-war testimony collected by historians studying the Italian campaign, was that it did not appear to depend on overwhelming material superiority in the way German commanders had been trained to expect, because in many of these mountain engagements, the terrain neutralized much of the American advantage in armor and mechanized support. Artillery observation was frequently blinded by fog and cloud cover that hung over the peaks for days, and air support, so often credited as the decisive factor in Allied victories elsewhere, was grounded for extended periods by the same weather, which meant that when German veterans looked back on these engagements, they could not simply attribute American success to firepower alone. They were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that the infantry itself, the individual soldier, and the small unit around him had displayed a level of tactical adaptability and raw determination that contradicted everything their pre-war assumptions had told them. And this is precisely why so many of these veterans, speaking decades after the war in interviews and memoirs, made a point of distinguishing between their respect for American air power, which was feared but understood as a product of industrial capacity, and their fear of American infantry, which felt personal, unpredictable, and rooted in something harder to quantify, the character of the individual soldier, rather than the output of a factory. The human cost of this grinding mountain war was staggering on both sides, and it's worth pausing to understand the scale of suffering involved, because the popular memory of the Italian campaign of 10 gets reduced to a handful of famous names: Anzio, Cassino, the liberation of Rome in June 1944, but the fighting continued for nearly a year after Rome fell, well into the spring of 1945, with American, British, Commonwealth, Polish, Brazilian, and other Allied forces continuing to claw their way through mountain after mountain against a German army that, even as it was clearly losing the broader war, fought with a discipline and lethality in the Italian terrain that made every mile enormously costly, and American infantry divisions in Italy suffered casualty rates that rivaled or exceeded many units fighting in France, with entire rifle companies being effectively destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the course of the campaign, a fact that makes the persistence and aggression German officers described all the more remarkable because these were not fresh, eager troops encountering combat for the first time in every engagement. In many cases, they were veteran units that had already been bled white and reconstituted with replacements, and yet unit cohesion and offensive spirit persisted in ways that defied simple explanations, a phenomenon that military historians have since attributed to a combination of factors, including the intensity and effectiveness of American small unit training, the quality and consistency of non-commissioned officer leadership, the psychological bonds formed within rifle squads and platoons under sustained combat stress, and a broader wartime culture that instilled in American soldiers a strong sense of obligation to comrades and unit, all of which combined to produce infantry that fought with far more tenacity than pre-war German assumptions had predicted. It's also worth noting that this German reassessment of American infantry did not happen in isolation. It paralleled a broader shift in German military thinking about the Western Allies that began in North Africa, accelerated through Sicily and Italy, and reached its full expression after the Normandy landings in June 1944, because the same pattern that Waffen-SS officers observed in the Italian mountains was echoed by German commanders fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy and later in the forests along the German border. But Italy holds a particular place in this story because it was there, in 1943 and 1944, that the pattern first became unmistakable to a German officer corps that had spent years dismissing American fighting capability as a footnote to their real concern, the industrial and technological might of the American war machine. And there's a certain historical irony in the fact that the branch of the German military most associated with ideological fanaticism and belief in Aryan racial superiority, the Waffen-SS, found itself among the units forced to confront and articulate, however reluctantly, the genuine combat effectiveness of an army built on entirely different principles, a citizen army drawn from a democracy, trained rapidly, and led in no small part by officers and sergeants who had been civilians less than 2 years before facing German veterans in the mountains above Florence. Beyond the tactical and psychological dimensions of this story lies a deeper truth about the nature of the Italian campaign itself, because it has often been characterized, both during and after the war, as a secondary theater, a costly diversion of resources from the main event in northwestern Europe. And there is truth in that assessment from a strategic standpoint. Italy did not deliver the kind of decisive breakthrough that Normandy eventually provided, and Allied planners, including Winston Churchill, who had pushed hard for the Italian campaign as a way to open what he famously called the soft underbelly of Europe, discovered that the underbelly was in fact one of the hardest fighting environments of the entire war. But from the perspective of the individual soldier on either side, German or American, the strategic debate meant little compared to the immediate reality of surviving the next ridge, the next stone farmhouse, the next artillery barrage. And it is in this ground-level reality that the true significance of German testimony about American infantry becomes clear, because these were not propaganda statements designed to inflate the reputation of an enemy for political purposes. They were private observations, often recorded decades after the war, when there was no longer any strategic benefit to be gained from praising the men who had defeated them. And the consistency of these observations across multiple units, multiple battles, and multiple years of fighting lends them a credibility that goes beyond simple wartime rhetoric, suggesting that something real and significant occurred in the psychological relationship between German defenders and American attackers in the mountains of Italy, a genuine recalibration of expectation that had lasting effects on how German forces approached combat against American units for the remainder of the war. As the Gothic Line finally collapsed in the spring of 1945, and American and other Allied forces poured into the Po Valley and toward the Alps, the German units that had fought so long and so hard in the mountains found themselves reflecting, even amid defeat, on an enemy that had confounded their expectations from the very first sustained contact, and many of the officers who survived to write memoirs or grant interviews in the decades that followed returned again and again to the same core observation that American air power had been terrifying in its scale and destructive capacity, an almost impersonal force of nature that could flatten a village or scatter a column of vehicles in minutes. But it was the American infantryman, the man in the foxhole, the man climbing the ridge under fire, the man who kept coming after his friends had fallen around him, who represented the deeper and more unsettling revelation of the entire campaign, because machines could be countered with tactics, with camouflage, with timing, but a soldier who would not stop attacking, who reorganized his own leadership under fire and pressed forward anyway, represented something that no amount of fortification or firepower could fully neutralize. And it is this testimony, gathered from the men who fought against them, elite, battle-hardened, and by any measure, some of the most capable soldiers in the German military, that offers one of the most striking and least appreciated verdicts on the American soldier of the Second World War. Not a verdict delivered by American commanders eager to praise their own men, but one wrung reluctantly from the mouths of the enemy who faced them across the mud and stone of the Italian mountains. And in the end, that may be the most powerful tribute any soldier can receive: the grudging, hard-won respect of the men who tried everything in their power to stop him and could not, a legacy carved, not in monuments or medals, but in the private memories of German veterans who, decades later and thousands of miles from those cold Apennine ridgelines, still remembered exactly what it felt like to watch American infantry climb back up the hill.